On July 14, 1941, German soldiers in the railway yard at Orsha experienced something that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. Without warning, the sky screamed. 112 rockets shrieked down from nowhere, their exhaust trails painting fire across the morning air. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, a howling, wailing chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When the barrage ended 10 seconds later, the station was gone. Trains, trucks, tanks, ammunition dumps, all transformed into a hellscape of twisted metal and burning men. The survivors fled in panic. They didn't know they had just witnessed the combat debut of the Katyusha rocket launcher, a weapon so secret that its crews were guarded by NKVD troops with orders to blow it up rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The launchers had only been approved for mass production the day before the German invasion began. Only 40 existed when the war started. Captain Ivan Flerov, commanding that first experimental battery of just 7 launchers, would die 3 months later near Smolensk, doing exactly what his orders demanded, detonating his launcher as German forces closed in, taking himself and his secrets to the grave. The panzers had already advanced 500 kilometers in just 18 days since crossing the Soviet border. The speed was staggering. They had covered ground faster than Napoleon's Grande Armée, faster than any army in history. By July 27th, armored spearheads would complete another textbook double envelopment, linking up on the far side of Smolensk just as they had at Minsk, just as they had done in France the year before. German forces now stood just 400 kilometers from Moscow, close enough that staff officers could calculate the remaining distance in days rather than weeks, close enough to taste victory. They would never get closer. What happened at Smolensk between July and September 1941 would cost Germany the war, transforming a tactical triumph into a strategic catastrophe that bled Blitzkrieg to death. This is the story of the battle that history forgot, not because it was insignificant, but because its true importance has been buried under the more famous disasters at Stalingrad and Kursk. By the time those battles were fought, Germany had already lost the war. The real turning point came here, in the summer of 1941, on the ancient road to Moscow that Napoleon himself had traveled. The German plan was elegant in its simplicity. Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group would cross the Dnieper River from the south, while Hermann Holtz's 3rd Panzer Group swept down from the north. The 2 armored pincers would meet east of Smolensk, trapping the Soviet armies defending the gateway to Moscow in a massive encirclement. It was the same formula that had crushed Poland in 4 weeks and France in 6. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. On July 10th, Guderian launched his surprise attack across the Dnieper. His forces overran the weak Soviet 13th Army within hours, punching through defenses that barely existed. By July 13th, his spearhead, the 29th Motorized Division, was already within 18 kilometers of Smolensk. The momentum seemed unstoppable. 3 days later, supported by the 17th Panzer Division, they broke into the city itself, capturing most of it in a lightning assault that seemed to confirm everything the Germans believed about their own invincibility. What followed was supposed to take days. It took weeks. German commanders believed they faced 11 Soviet divisions around Smolensk. Their intelligence had catastrophically failed them. Thanks to Stalin's desperate decision to commit virtually the entire strategic reserve to this sector, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko actually commanded 66 divisions, plus sizable reserves still arriving from the interior. The German High Command had no idea what was waiting for them in the forests and swamps around the ancient city. The 29th, motorized, captured most of Smolensk on July 16th, but the suburbs refused to fall. For an entire week, German troops fought house to house against repeated counterattacks from the Soviet 16th Army under Lieutenant General Mikhail Lukin. Soviet soldiers emerged from cellars and rooftops, attacked supply columns on forest roads, ambushed messengers and isolated vehicles. Snipers picked off officers with terrifying accuracy. This wasn't Poland. This wasn't France. The enemy kept fighting when they should have surrendered, kept attacking when they should have retreated, kept dying rather than giving ground. General Gerhard Heinrici, commanding German infantry in the sector, wrote home with undisguised concern, "The Russians are very strong and fight with desperation. They appear suddenly all over the place, shooting, falling upon columns, individual vehicles, messengers. Our losses are considerable. What the Germans were encountering was something new, an enemy that didn't follow the rules of civilized warfare as they understood it, an enemy that would rather die than submit. By July 15th, the armored pincers of both panzer groups had nearly closed the trap. Just 16 kilometers separated them, barely 10 miles. One more push and the pocket would be sealed, trapping 3 Soviet armies, the 16th, 19th, and 20th, containing nearly 400,000 men. It should have been a simple matter of linking up. The panzers had done it before, many times. Then Stalin made a decision that would help save Moscow. Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky had just arrived in Moscow from Ukraine, still carrying the physical scars of 3 years in the Gulag. NKVD interrogators had knocked out 9 of his teeth and broken 3 of his ribs during endless sessions of questioning about imaginary crimes. He had been released only because the Red Army desperately needed experienced commanders. Most of the others had been executed in Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, victims of the same paranoia that had nearly destroyed Rokossovsky himself. Now, this battered survivor was immediately dispatched to stop the unstoppable. Timoshenko gave him command of something called Group Yartsevo, a formation that existed in name only, a desperate improvisation born of crisis. Rokossovsky later recalled his initial command with bitter irony. The general staff gave me 2 trucks mounting quad anti-aircraft machine guns with crews, a radio truck, and a small group of officers. That was it. 2 trucks against 2 panzer groups. He left Moscow with a handful of people to stop the most powerful military machine on Earth. It seemed like suicide. But Rokossovsky was brilliant, experienced, and utterly desperate. He scraped together retreating stragglers along the road from Moscow to Yartsevo, stopping every vehicle, pressing every soldier he could find into his improvised command. He pulled together the 101st Tank Division, the 107th Mechanized Division, fragments from the shattered 44th Rifle Corps. Retreating regiments and divisions filtering out of the Smolensk pocket were transferred to his command. Fresh forces trickled in from the reserve. Day by day, hour by hour, he assembled a fighting force from the wreckage of the front. When the 7th Panzer Division, the famous Ghost Division that had raced through France, tried to close the gap at Yartsevo, Rokossovsky's improvised force stopped them cold. For 2 weeks, his ragtag command held open a corridor barely 16 kilometers wide, a narrow lifeline through which elements of 3 Soviet armies could escape the closing pocket. The fighting in this small area between Smolensk and Yartsevo turned into a brutal slugfest, with both sides suffering horrendous casualties in close combat. On July 24th, Rokossovsky's forces temporarily drove the Germans from Yartsevo. The Germans retook it. Rokossovsky's men took it back. By July 29th, his 101st Tank Division recaptured the town after paying a terrible toll in men and machines. On July 30th, Rokossovsky's task force finally broke through to the 2 beleaguered Soviet armies trapped at Smolensk. By then, some divisions were down to less than 2,000 men each, barely the strength of a peacetime regiment. The scene at the Dnieper River crossings turned into chaos. A desperate rout, with soldiers literally storming the bridges to escape. Rear support units fled first, often abandoning valuable equipment and vehicles. But over the next several days, relative order was restored, and the bulk of the survivors from the 16th and 20th Armies crossed to the east bank of the river. Rokossovsky is credited with slowing the German attack long enough to prevent the capture of potentially hundreds of thousands of additional Soviet troops who would be reconstituted and thrown back into the fight for Moscow in the desperate months ahead. The Germans still won the encirclement. By late July, the Smolensk pocket was officially closed. But closed didn't mean finished. The victory that looked so complete on staff maps was far messier on the ground. Inside the pocket, Soviet forces refused to die quickly. They attacked from within while fresh armies attacked from without. Timoshenko launched continuous counteroffensives starting July 21st, throwing the newly arrived 24th, 28th, 29th, and 30th Armies against the German perimeter. These formations had been mobilized just days or weeks earlier, poorly trained recruits led by inexperienced officers, under-equipped, and often lacking basic weapons. They attacked anyway, hurling themselves against German defensive positions in waves that seemed suicidal but never stopped coming. The casualties were catastrophic on both sides, but especially for the Soviets. Soviet losses for the entire Smolensk operation would reach approximately 760,000 men, nearly 500,000 killed, captured, or missing, plus another 270,000 wounded. German forces captured somewhere between 300,000 and 565,000 prisoners, depending on which count you trust and how you define the boundaries of the battle. But the Germans bled too, and unlike the Soviets, they couldn't replace their losses. Army Group Center suffered approximately 115,000 casualties between July 10th and September 10th, killed and wounded that the Wehrmacht could never fully replace. These weren't raw recruits, but experienced soldiers, veterans of Poland and France, the backbone of the German military machine. Many panzer divisions were down to less than 50% of their authorized tank strength. Some 200 tanks were destroyed beyond repair, not by superior Soviet armor, but by breakdowns, by anti-tank guns, by the sheer attrition of constant combat. Ammunition ran critically short, fuel ran out entirely in some units, stranding vehicles that should have been racing toward Moscow. At Yelnya, 70 kilometers southeast of Smolensk, Guderian's 10th Panzer Division seized a bridgehead on July 19th that was supposed to be the springboard for the final drive on Moscow. The heights around Yelnya dominated the surrounding terrain, perfect ground for launching the next phase of the advance. Instead, the bridgehead became a bleeding wound that would drain German strength for 6 weeks. The Germans ran out of fuel getting there. They almost ran out of ammunition holding it. For 6 weeks, German forces clung to the Yelnya salient, while Soviet counterattacks battered them day after day, night after night. The 10th Panzer Division, the SS Das Reich Division, elements of multiple infantry divisions, all were fed into the meat grinder of Yelnya, and all emerged diminished. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, wrote in growing frustration, "I was now forced to commit all of my combat-capable divisions from the Army Group's reserve into combat. We needed every man forward. In spite of huge losses, the enemy attacked daily in several sectors, so that, up to this time, it has not been possible to regroup forces and bring up reserves." The army that had conquered France in 6 weeks could no longer advance in Russia. The machine was grinding to a halt. On July 27th, von Bock assembled his commanders at his headquarters in Novi Borisov for what became one of the most contentious meetings of the war. Also present were Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, and Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff. What should have been a routine planning session devolved into something approaching open mutiny against Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler had already signaled his intention to divert forces away from Moscow. Führer Directive 33, issued July 14th, reoriented the main German effort toward Ukraine in the south and Leningrad in the north. The generals were horrified. Moscow was just 400 kilometers away. The road was open, or at least it had been before Smolensk. Winter was coming, and every officer in the room knew what that meant. Every day of delay was a day the Soviets could use to prepare defenses, move reinforcements from Siberia, recover from their catastrophic losses in the border battles. Guderian recorded in his journal that Hitler preferred a plan by which small enemy forces were to be encircled and destroyed piecemeal, and the enemy thus bled to death. The Führer was more interested in economic targets, the grain of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, the industry of the Donbass, than in capturing the Soviet capital. Every officer present believed this was a catastrophic mistake. Moscow was the heart. Cut out the heart, and the body dies. But what could they do? Hitler was the supreme commander. He made the decisions. He had made all the decisions that had brought them from the Rhine to the Dnieper in just 2 years. Who were they to question his genius now? What happened next shocked even hardened Wehrmacht veterans. The generals decided to defy their Führer. After returning to their commands, Guderian, Hoth, and Bock conspired to delay the implementation of Directive 33, which meant openly defying the direct orders of Adolf Hitler himself. Guderian hastily assembled a plan for continued offensive operations toward Moscow, scheduled to begin August 1st. The generals would present Hitler with a fait accompli, force his hand, drive on Moscow whether he approved or not. Then came Führer Directive 34, issued July 30th. Hitler acknowledged the reality that his generals had been trying to hide from him, the reality that Smolensk had forced into the open. The development of the situation in the last few days, he wrote, the appearance of strong enemy forces on the front, and to the flanks of Army Group Center, the supply position, and the need to give 2nd and 3rd Armored Groups about 10 days to rehabilitate their units, make it necessary to postpone for the moment the further tasks and objectives. 10 days to rehabilitate. The panzer groups that had crossed entire countries in weeks now needed 10 days just to recover from Smolensk. The invincible Wehrmacht was exhausted. The bleeding around the ancient gateway city had finally caught up with them, and even Hitler could see it. On August 11th, Franz Halder sat down to record his thoughts in his war diary. What he wrote would prove prophetic. The whole situation makes it increasingly plain that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. Soviet divisions are not armed and equipped according to our standards, and their tactical leadership is often poor. But there they are, and after smashing dozens of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. They are near their own resources, while we are moving further and further away from ours. And so our troops, sprawled over an immense front line, without any depth, are subjected to the incessant attacks of the enemy. At the outset of Barbarossa, German intelligence had estimated the Soviet Union possessed approximately 200 divisions. By August, they had already counted 360. And more kept appearing from nowhere, from Siberia, from Central Asia, from training depots that seemed inexhaustible. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, put it more bluntly. The vastness of Russia devours us. The arithmetic of Blitzkrieg had broken down completely. In Poland, encircling the enemy army had meant winning the war. In France, the same. But in Russia, destroying one army simply meant fighting another that appeared from the endless depths of the Soviet interior. The operational art that had conquered Western Europe in weeks was grinding down into a war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Germany could not win. On August 30th, Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed commander of the Reserve Front and already emerging as Stalin's most trusted battlefield commander, launched a coordinated offensive against the Yelnya salient. For 10 days, the 24th Army and 43rd Army hammered at the German lines with everything they had. Soviet troops literally had to tear their way through German defenses. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, bought with thousands of lives. By September 3rd, under growing threat of encirclement, the Germans began retreating from the salient they had held for 6 weeks. One German infantryman captured the bitter reality in his diary. Officially, it was called a planned withdrawal. But to me, it was so much bullshit. The next day, we heard on the radio about the successful front correction in our Yelnya defensive lines and the enormous losses we inflicted on the enemy. But no single word was heard about a retreat, about the hopelessness of the situation, about the mental and emotional numbness of the German soldiers. In short, it was again a victory. But we on the front line were running back like rabbits in front of the fox. This metamorphosis of the truth from all shit to "it was a victory" baffled me, and those of my comrades who dared to think. On September 8th, Soviet forces liberated Yelnya. It was the first significant piece of territory recaptured from Hitler's Wehrmacht anywhere in Europe since the war began. Just 100 to 150 square kilometers, a tiny patch of burned villages and churned earth that had cost tens of thousands of lives. But it was the first time since 1939 that the Wehrmacht had been forced to give ground and keep it given. The fighting at Yelnya had cost the German Dexiex Army Corps over 23,000 casualties. The 4th Army would not recover from these losses for the rest of the year. For what? A bridgehead they couldn't hold, a springboard to nowhere. To honor the divisions that had bled and died taking back that small patch of ground, the Soviet High Command created something new: the Guards designation. On September 18th, the 100th Rifle Division was renamed the 1st Guards Rifle Division. The 127th became the 2nd Guards. Later, The 107th and 120th would become the 5th and 6th Guards. The title would become the highest honor a Soviet military unit could receive, a tradition that would last through the rest of the war and beyond into the Soviet era. It was born in the mud and blood of Smolensk. The Battle of Smolensk officially ended on September 10, 1941. It had lasted exactly 2 months, July 10th to September 10th. 2 months in which the Wehrmacht had advanced not toward Moscow, but in circles around Smolensk, bleeding against Soviet counterattacks, consuming irreplaceable men and machines, while time, the most precious resource of all, slipped away with every passing day. Hitler then made matters worse. Rather than immediately resuming the Moscow drive after Smolensk, he ordered Guderian's panzer group south to complete the encirclement of Kiev in Ukraine. It was tactically brilliant. The Kiev pocket yielded 665,000 Soviet prisoners, the largest single encirclement in military history. German propaganda trumpeted the achievement, but it consumed another precious month while the Russian autumn crept closer. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, did not launch until October 2, 1941, more than 3 months after the fall of Smolensk. Initially, it succeeded brilliantly, reprising all the glories of the summer campaign. German forces encircled and destroyed several more Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 600,000 prisoners. Moscow seemed within reach. On October 15th, the Soviet government began evacuating to Kuibyshev on the Volga. Stalin stayed in the Kremlin, but the situation appeared hopeless. Then came the Rasputitsa. On October 7th, the first snow fell, melting almost immediately and turning every road into a river of mud. Russian soldiers had a name for this season, Rasputitsa, which translates roughly as the time without roads. German trucks sank to their axles and could not be pulled free. Tanks could barely move and burned precious fuel trying. Horses died by the thousands from sheer exhaustion, dragging wagons through the mire. The whole offensive ground to a halt in a sea of clinging black mud that seemed to swallow everything. On October 31st, the German High Command ordered a complete stop to offensive operations. The army would wait for the ground to freeze before attempting to move again. There was simply no other choice. The pause gave Zhukov precious time he used ruthlessly. While the Germans waited for winter to harden the ground, the Soviets moved fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East. Battle-hardened troops equipped for cold weather, many of them veterans of border clashes with Japan who had never faced the Wehrmacht. The delay had given the Soviets time to strengthen their defenses with nearly 1 million additional troops and 1,000 new T-34 tanks. Tanks that the Germans had discovered, to their horror, were nearly impervious to their standard anti-tank weapons. When the ground finally froze in mid-November, the Germans attacked again with everything they had left. The northern pincer reached within 30 kilometers of the Kremlin. German reconnaissance units advanced to the town of Khimki, just 30 kilometers from the center of Moscow. A patrol from the 2nd Panzer Division reportedly reached a point where officers could see the spires of the capital through their field glasses. It was the closest they would ever come. On December 5th, 1941, the temperature dropped to historic lows. Some reports claimed 40 degrees below zero. German troops, still wearing summer uniforms because winter clothing had been held up in Poland for lack of transport priority, began freezing to death in their foxholes. Over 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported. Tank engines wouldn't start. Weapons wouldn't fire. Men who fell asleep on guard duty never woke up. That same day, the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh Siberian divisions slammed into exhausted German lines along the entire front. These were not the poorly trained, badly equipped formations that had been shattered at Smolensk. These were veterans, soldiers who had spent years guarding the Manchurian border against Japan, who knew how to fight in snow and cold, who came equipped with proper winter gear, while German soldiers wrapped themselves in stolen blankets and stuffed newspapers into their boots. The Wehrmacht, which had not experienced significant retreat since the war began more than 2 years earlier, suddenly found itself falling back in disorder. Within weeks, the Germans had been pushed back over 100 kilometers in some sectors. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, died in the snow outside Moscow. Moscow was saved. Blitzkrieg was dead. And the long road to Berlin, a road that would cost 27 million Soviet lives, had begun. The mathematics of Smolensk are damning when you lay them out clearly. The battle lasted from July 10th to September 10th, exactly 2 months. Add the month diverted to Kiev through September and early October, and you get roughly 3 months of total delay. Operation Typhoon launched October 2nd and ran headlong into the autumn mud season by October 7th, just 5 days later. If the Moscow offensive had begun in late July or early August instead, as the generals had begged Hitler to allow, the panzers might have reached the capital before the Rasputitsa, before Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia, before the defenses had time to harden into the killing ground that stopped them. Even Hitler understood what had been lost. At Novi Borisov on July 27th, his generals had pleaded with him to let them drive on Moscow immediately while momentum was still on their side. He refused. By December, when his frozen armies were retreating through the snow, he had no choice but to face the consequences of that decision. Guderian later wrote with bitter hindsight, "Kiev was certainly a brilliant tactical success, but the question of whether it had a significant strategic importance still remains open. Everything now depended on our ability to achieve expected results before the winter and even before the autumn rains. They didn't achieve those results. They couldn't. Smolensk had already bled them too badly and consumed too much precious time. The Battle of Smolensk cost the Wehrmacht more than 115,000 casualties, over 200 tanks destroyed beyond repair, and 2 irreplaceable months of the campaign season. It exhausted the panzer divisions that were supposed to capture Moscow, divisions that had been the sharp edge of the German sword, now blunted against Soviet resistance. It consumed the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that the advance on the capital would desperately need. It shattered the timeline that Blitzkrieg required to function, the ruthless schedule that demanded victory before the enemy could recover, before winter could freeze the advance in its tracks, before the infinite resources of the Russian interior could be mobilized. The generals had known from the beginning that speed was everything. Guderian himself had written before the battle that if the panzers did not reach their objectives quickly, whether the infantry would then be able to smash a well-organized river defensive line so that mobile warfare might once again be possible seemed doubtful. His doubts proved prophetic. Mobile warfare died at Smolensk, replaced by the grinding positional combat that Germany could never win. Soviet losses were far worse in absolute terms. 760,000 casualties, perhaps 500,000 captured or killed. But the Soviet Union could replace those losses from its vast population of nearly 200 million people. Germany, with a population less than half that size and already stretched thin across occupied Europe, could not. The Red Army was fighting near its own resources, its own factories, its own population centers. The Wehrmacht was fighting at the end of a supply line stretching back thousands of kilometers to the Reich. Every bullet and every gallon of fuel transported over roads that barely deserved the name. What Smolensk revealed was the fatal flaw built into Blitzkrieg doctrine from the beginning. The system was designed for short campaigns against nations that would collapse after decisive defeats. Poland had collapsed. France had collapsed. Even the mighty British Empire had been driven from the continent. The Soviet Union refused to collapse. Every army destroyed was replaced by another army from the endless reserves of Soviet manpower. Every encirclement yielded prisoners, but not victory. The operational art that had made Germany master of Europe was useless against an enemy that could absorb unlimited punishment and keep fighting. The Wehrmacht had the capability to win battles. It did not have the capability to win this war. Captain Ivan Flerov, who had unleashed those first screaming Katyusha rockets at Orsha on July 14th, was dead by October. Caught in an encirclement near the village of Bogatyr in the Smolensk region, with his vehicles immobilized by marshy terrain and out of ammunition, he ordered his secret weapons destroyed rather than let them fall into German hands. Severely wounded, Flerov detonated the lead launcher himself. Of his 170 men, only 46 escaped the encirclement. The Germans never captured a single intact Katyusha. But the rockets survived and multiplied. By war's end, 10,000 Katyusha launchers would serve in the Red Army. Their howling salvos would accompany the Soviet advance from Stalingrad to the Vistula to the streets of Berlin itself. The Germans called them Stalin's organ for the sound they made, the pipes arranged like an organ, the rockets screaming like a funeral hymn. It was a dirge for the Wehrmacht, first heard in the railway yard at Orsha as the Battle of Smolensk began. British war correspondent Alexander Werth visited Yelnya shortly after its liberation in September 1941. He walked through the ruins of a town that had once held 15,000 people. Nearly all the able-bodied men and women had been formed into forced labor battalions and driven to the German rear. Only a few hundred old people and children had been allowed to stay. On the night before the Wehrmacht pulled out, survivors told him they had been locked in the church while German soldiers systematically looted the houses and set each one on fire. But Werth saw something else in that devastation, something that transcended the destruction. He wrote, "Here was not only, as it were, the first victory of the Red Army over the Germans. Here was also the first piece of territory, perhaps only 100 to 150 square miles, in the whole of Europe reconquered from Hitler's Wehrmacht." It is strange to think that in 1941, even that was considered an achievement. It was more than an achievement. It was a prophecy of what was to come. From this small patch of burned earth would flow a tide that would not stop until it reached Berlin. Smolensk is forgotten because it was neither simple victory nor simple defeat. It was something more troubling, a battle that the Germans won tactically while losing strategically, a triumph that concealed a fatal wound. The panzers captured the city. They took their hundreds of thousands of prisoners, they reported their success to Berlin, and then they bled, exhausted, out of fuel and out of time, while the road to Moscow slipped away forever. History remembers Stalingrad as the turning point, the moment when the tide shifted and Germany began its long retreat to destruction. History remembers Kursk as the death of German offensive capability, the last great armored assault that broke against Soviet defenses. But by the time those battles were fought, the war was already lost. The real turning point came earlier, in the summer of 1941, when the invincible Wehrmacht met an enemy that refused to be conquered in a battle that ground Blitzkrieg into the Russian mud. The panzers had done it again at Smolensk, another perfect encirclement, another massive haul of prisoners, another triumph for German arms. And 220 miles from Moscow, close enough to see victory, close enough to taste the end of the Soviet Union, they discovered that victory would never come. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.